Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about dynamics of language. More specifically, we're going to cover impacts of language using empowering language, a concept called Rogerian arguments, verbal adjustments, the three purposes of rhetoric, and dynamics of self-disclosure. So a lot of things to discuss. Let's go ahead and get into it. So impacts of language. Language really your rhetoric and your word choice can have a variety of impacts on other people and their perception of you, as well as the language that you hear, of course, and your perception of a situation or yourself. So some of the common categories are labels and identity that language can impact. It can create solidarity and divergence. It can confer responsibility, and it can ultimately just shape our reality. Okay, and so this is kind of going to that concept where you hear people say, words matter, right? And it sounds maybe a little cliche or something like that, but we're going to talk about all the different reasons why, yes, words matter, right? How they're affecting you. So let's just start right from the top with like labels and identity, okay? So a good example of this, and I think I might have mentioned this in a previous video, is that in American culture, Americans have a tendency, excuse me, to tie their identity a lot to their occupation. So one of the ways to get this get studied is one of the first questions that people will ask somebody when they first meet them is, "What do you do for a living?" And in other cultures and other countries specifically, people have a tendency to say, "Well, I work as a fill in the blank," right? In American culture, Americans tend to say, "Well, I work as a fill in the blank." So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that Americans tend to associate their identity, who they are, with what their job is, right? It's tied if it's tied to your identity, that means it's tied to a lot of other things like self-worth, right? And all these other sorts of things. Now, so how does that matter? Right? Versus if you just say, well, I work as, and it's something I do, but it's not necessarily who I am, right? Well, there's a couple ways that can matter. So if you have a job that society values, right? If you're the head of pediatrics, if you're a surgeon, if you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, like you're all these things that society looks upon it with admiration, then you're kind of winning at that game, right? But there's two sides to that sword, of course, right? And if you have a job that maybe society takes for granted or doesn't value, then that can really hurt your self-worth, right? Your self-concept and your self-esteem, because you will just think lesser of yourself, right? Because you're labeled as being this thing, and the label of the job is not something that society values. So that's just an example of this concept of labels do have a tendency to shape our identity. And really what I should say there is self-concept and self-esteem. It's kind of affecting all three. If you remember from a previous video, I said self-concept is what you think of yourself. Self-esteem is if you think those things are good or bad, and identity is what you project to other people. So if we tie a lot of who you are with your occupation in this case, and with job titles, what I'm trying to say is that can be good or bad. And so that's a little tricky to be doing that, right? So you got to be careful if you want to do that. So, but that's an example of labels shaping reality. And in this case, with occupations. And we've also seen some adjustments to that. So for example, there's kind of been this like shifting or renaming of occupations. And not on one hand, it can make people feel better, right? So you're not a secretary, you're an administrative assistant. You're not a janitor, you're a custodial engineer. And again, people will sometimes say, well, this is just PC, make people feel better. Well, no, I could argue that it's just accurately labeling things, right? Like a secretary typically does more than just answer phones. They really probably are fairly called an administrative assistant, right? And a janitor, a custodian's doing all kinds of things besides just, pushing a mop and emptying garbage bins, right? So you can argue it's just being accurate with the labels, but language shapes those sorts of things. Solidarity and divergence and like responsibility. This is sort of an example of if I come into a room and I'm the leader of a team and I say, all right, so you've got a problem. Sales are down 20% than expected last quarter. You guys have got to figure out a way to either be more productive or in terms of being innovative so we can sell more products or close better with the products we have. But you got to figure this out because this 20% reduction is not sustainable. It's not going to work. And if this continues, we're going to have to lay people off. So, what are you guys going to do about this? right? This is not going to happen on my watch. All the language that I just used basically says this is a YP, not an MP. It's your fault. It's your problem. Deal with it. Because I said you have a problem. You need to improve sales, right? You need to improve productivity. So I use kind of language of us and them, right? Me and you. This is your problem. Versus if I for joint responsibility, if I came into that room and I said, even though I was still the leader, right, and I could still make certain decisions, if I came in the room and I said, we have a problem, our sales are down, we need to find ways to either be more innovative or close better with the products or services we currently offer, that is basically coming in the room and saying, this is a shared issue. How do we fix it? Right. And again, you could apply, I tend to gravitate more towards like business or professional examples, but you can apply that to your personal life. If you're having, we talk later, I have another video where I talk about relationships, but if you're having a conflict in a relationship or a fight, or there's some sort of tension, if you come in the room and you say, well, the problem is you, why don't you get your act together? Or why are you doing this? Or why are you doing that? Instead of reframing it more of a, how can we solve this? Right? Usually conferring that joint responsibility is a little bit better. And then language can shape reality in a variety of different ways. Okay. So I just want to give you, look, you can take classes that have all kinds of examples of this, but there's a variety of ways that language shapes our experiences. Now, the technical sort of term for this, or like theory, is something called the Safari-Whorf hypothesis, which is basically just saying, hey, language can shape reality. And the way you see that is basically just language titles and labels things. It gives meaning to things. And you can certainly use words or phrases that give something a positive connotation or a negative connotation, right? A little bit later in this PowerPoint, I'm going to talk about connotative meaning. Connotative meaning basically just means a word or phrase will have a literal dictionary definition, right? What it actually reads if you look it up, if you just Google it. That's what's called a denotative meaning. A connotative meaning is either an emotional meaning, right? That's kind of developed from the word is typically what it is. So there's obviously words or phrases that when you slap that label on somebody, it's positive, right? It sort of promotes them. And then there's also words or phrases that if you slap that label on them, it's negative, right? And so it can really shape reality. If somebody commits, anytime there's a military conflict, right? If there's two sides fighting, let's just say for simplistic purposes, it's two sides fighting the conflict. So if you're in country A that's fighting, well, country A is going to tell its people, our fighters are soldiers and they're terrorists and evildoers, and you name, pick the awful term to use to describe somebody in war, right? You do realize if you were in country B, they're going to say that you're the terrorists and they're the freedom fighters, right? Because obviously the word terrorist has a negative connotation, right? You don't want to be classified as that, right? So words or phrases can create that sort of like shape, like, is this a good thing or a bad thing, right? What you're doing. So because words or phrases have meanings associated with them, right? That are good or bad. Now, again, sometimes we're going to talk a little bit more about this a little bit later, but like sometimes this gets really warped where people are just using words or phrases in a positive or negative way, and they're not actually using them. It's so far removed from the literal definition, it's a joke. But basically, just pointing out that language shapes reality. Okay, and another sort of like secondary theory related to this that's even more specific is this notion of like muted groups theory. Okay, so if words or phrases can shape reality because they can suggest something's positive or they can suggest something's negative, which is what I was just talking about. What muted groups theory is basically saying is another way you can shape reality is just don't give them language to describe their experience. And if you don't give them language, it's like it didn't happen. Okay, that's basically what the theory is. Now, again, whether you agree with these, this comes back to something I mentioned. I usually mention early on in my classes that, when you're dealing with social science courses, they're not necessarily looking for 100% absolute. So, like, there's theories like this that are tested, and you see them bear out in the real world of actually working, but it doesn't mean it works 100% of the time. So, it doesn't mean you necessarily have to 100% agree with this. But you could certainly maybe see it happening in a lot of situations, right? Doesn't mean it happens in every situation. It just means that it does happen in some and could happen in a lot sometimes, depending on the theory. So again, muted groups theory is basically saying if I don't give you words to describe your experience, I basically shut you up, right? And people are like, well, that doesn't happen. How could that, that could happen? Well, there's lots of ways that can happen. So for an example I like to use would be like, let's say we're going to go back in time. So Michael J. Fox strolls in and he's brought the DeLorean back to the future. Okay. And we're going to go back in time, and we just go back in time. It's like the 1920s or something. And I don't know, maybe if I go back to the 50s, that's far back enough. But I go into an office with Michael J. Fox, and we're just observing, right, this office. And I don't know, maybe we're invisible. They can't see us or something. And so we're in this office, and let's say, so in that traditional or gender roles in that office at that time is probably statistically going to be this. The male is the supervisor, and there's women working there, but they're usually in more like subordinate positions, like, again, like an assistant or something like that. So let's say the female in this scenario experiences sexual harassment, some sort of conduct that's clearly sexual harassment. Now it's 1920. So we're in this office, it's 1920, it's 1950, color hasn't been invented yet, right? Can she say, like, can she go to HR and say, I was the victim of sexual harassment? Can she go to the police and say, I want to file a police report, I was experienced sexual harassment? That'd be like you today going to HR and saying, somebody just widgeted me. And they're going to say, what's being widgeted? And you'd explain it and be like, I've never heard of being widgeted. We don't have, sorry, I don't see widgeted here in the handbook because there's no language for it. Like the term sexual harassment had to be invented for you to complain about it, right? So this is and look, so think about it. Was sexual harassment going on in offices in 1920 and 1950, however far back we got to go before the word's invented? It was, of course it was, right? Unfortunately. But if you don't have language to describe your experience, you can shut people up because I just don't give you words. Or another example would be, because again, it'd be like you saying I was widgeted, right? Another example would be, you may have heard the phrase, I think I've mentioned this also in another video, the victors write history. To the victors go the spoils. And what that's referring to is, in a situation, whoever sort of wins the day and is now in control of something, they get to control the narrative. They get to write the narrative. And oftentimes they will use words and write the narrative in a way that silences other opinions and perspectives, right? Because they don't like those opinions or perspectives. And the notion is that if you silence them enough, if you just bury them, then people kind of like, eventually if nobody talked about them, there's that phrase, time heals all wounds. Well, you can also make the argument of time covers up all things too, right? If there's no record of it. So that's muted groups theory. It's basically this notion of you can silence people by just not giving them words to express themselves or not let them express themselves, not give them avenues to express themselves. And so that's basically what the concept is. Again, you see this sort of borne out through different types of examples and research and that sort of stuff. But that's basically what the concept is. So there you have muted groups theory. And again, that's sort of a more specific example of how language can shape reality. This also goes back to something we've mentioned before several times, is low and high context cultures and how they are directly affecting your language in terms of how they encourage you to express yourself and what they tell you to focus on in terms of communication. So again, low context cultures basically tell people to express themselves as directly as possible to accomplish their goal or get their message across, while high context cultures do use a little bit more ambiguity and context in a way that kind of massages people's feelings. You don't want to be abrasive. You don't want to be offensive, right? And as I mentioned before, in most scenarios, American culture is very low context. We're very direct. It's pretty much just about me, myself, and I. And again, the example I always use with that is look at social media. If you don't believe that, all social media is look at me, look at me, look at modern entertainment, look at sports, look at pop culture, look at the music industry. Everything's look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me. Attention for me, right? So that's what it is, and so you have that's another example of language and culture sort of affecting things. Now let's kind of I think this kind of like really gets to kind of more of like the root of this in terms of like just how this is happening, how language is really affecting reality. So how language is really doing this is that basically this goes back to something that I usually talk about early on in communication courses, which is that uh, language is ambiguous in any culture at any time. Does not matter where it's going to be ambiguous 100 years from now too, and it's always been ambiguous. And what that means, ambiguity means it can have more than one meaning that can be drawn from that, right? So if you're looking for a job and your friend says, "Have you found a job yet?" you will probably take that as just your friend being curious if you found a job. But if you're looking for a job and your significant other says it, who you're splitting the rent with, right? Or it's the parents of your significant other and you're about to get married, you might take that differently. You might take it as a little more pressure packed, right? Because this is somebody you're splitting the bills with, you're planning a future with. It's the same words, different meaning because of context, right? Tone of voice could change it. Connotative meaning could change it. Emotional meaning, right? So if language is ambiguous, that means it can shape reality in multiple ways, right? So that's basically what's going on here. Connotative meaning, when I say get to the heart of this, is what I mean by that is just like a clear example of it. Connotative meaning is one of the best like clear examples where these words take on emotional meanings, or personally, I kind of like also consider it basically words also taking on meanings with just how they're being used in everyday vernacular, right? Or sometimes even weaponized in everyday vernacular, and in a way that where they take on this meaning that's positive or negative all on their own, right? Based on how the culture is using them, or it's again being weaponized or something like that. And they just shape different realities, right? Now, again, this can be used in a good way, right? To make people feel better. It can be used in a negative way. One of the if you're going to be kind of like, one of the things about communication that certainly sometimes communication people that are in the field can find frustrating, I think it's kind of frustrating, is you certainly will see examples of where the connotative or the emotional meaning, the emotional charge that gets associated with a word is like insanely far removed from what it really means. It's like, and whenever I make movie references past like 2000, a lot of times people look at me just with it's like I'm referencing like cave drawings from the 1800s or something. They're like, what? But it's like the movie The Princess Bride. Good movie. If you've not seen The Princess Bride, shame on you. Do better. You got to see that movie. But old movie, and I think it's from the 90s, like early 90s. But there's a scene in there where one of the characters says, "You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means." And so you'll see with connotative meaning is sometimes these emotional meanings come up and they just totally warp the word. So I'll give you an example of this. If I come into a college class and I did a survey, and I think I could pick any major, it wouldn't really matter, but I do a survey and you have like 10 questions in there. Now, when you're studying people, the question I want to really ask you about, the gotcha question, it's going to be buried within like 9 fake questions, or questions that tell me something but they're not as important, right? Because I can't just give away what I'm trying to get at, right? So I'm going to ask you a series of like 10, 20 survey questions. But in one of the questions I ask you is, do you believe men and women should have equal access to things? And maybe I tell you what the things are, like equal pay. Should men and women have equal pay? Access to scholarship opportunities, you name it. I list several things, just like basic equality, right? Now, if I ask a college class that, I'm going to get, I think a lot of classes I'll get 100% yes, or overall, I bet I would get a 99, 98% absolutely. I'm going to get very few no's on that question. Particularly at a college class, right? So, okay. But let's say I ask other classes the same survey, but on that question I change it. And now I'm going to insert a word with connotative meaning in a kind of a negative way. So now I say the same thing. Do you believe men and women should? So instead of that, I change it and I say, are you a feminist? Are you a feminist? I'm not getting 100% anymore. I don't think I'd get 100% in any class. I don't think I'd get 98% in any class. I think there may be some classes where I get in the 80s. I think I'm going to get some Maybe I get some 70s, a lot of 70s, I bet. It's high 60s. It's the same damn question. And if you don't think so, again, I'm sorry you don't understand what the word means. If you look up the actual literal dictionary, academic, research-based definition of what a feminist is, what feminism is as a theory, it just means equal access to things. It means don't discriminate based on gender. Right? That's all it means. But the word has taken on a different meaning. Like, that's the original meaning. And so people should answer that question the same way, because guess what? The first question was asking if you're a feminist too. But I just didn't use that word because it's charged. Now, what is the word taken on? When the people now answered it to like high 60s and you had more people say no, it doesn't necessarily mean they're all, evil and terrible people. What's going on? Well, they're thinking of the word as like extremist, right? Because the word feminism is now kind of associated with extremist, right? Or sort of this sort of anti-male kind of thing, or biased, or something like that, right? Certainly right now you're seeing in culture, like young men feeling this sense, right? So that like masculinity is being attacked, all that sort of stuff. So the word feminism is now charged with all of these other meanings, right? And so the language of the word feminism is now shaping a different reality than it used to, because it's created this meaning. Now, personally, when I said, if you don't understand that, too bad. Look, personally, this is one of those, like, the horse is out of the barn, right? Like, to me, like, it's pretty clear. It's an objective. It's not an opinion. It's not debatable. People are using the word in society now totally different than what it actually was supposed to mean, right? It's been weaponized to mean extremist, anti-male, attacking masculinity kind of thing. But that's not what it means. If you go back to the original definition, if you go back to like the actual people who sort of created feminist theory and that kind of stuff, none of that sort of extremism is there. So that's an example of a word just like taking off. And again, that's probably maybe a more charged example, but I can use other examples. And sometimes they're really stupid, like meaning people try to weaponize words or phrases as like positive or negative, and it's just totally been created out of like nothing. So an example would be like, you'll see people say, like people that are criticizing a commentator, and then they'll say, well, that's just your rhetoric, right? You're just, I'm not here to listen to their like crazy rhetoric. I'm just here to talk about the facts. Okay, the word rhetoric means language. So the person just said, I'm not here to listen to your language. That doesn't make any sense. But people hear the word rhetoric and they think something bad, right? Another example, or this is now a couple years old, but like you saw on social media where there was somebody would say have an opinion, and then the response to the opinion, people would say, "Okay, boomer," right? Because what's going on? So the word boomer is associated with you're old, you're out of touch, like you're just out of touch with things. And so the word has taken on this emotional charge in a negative way. Like nobody said never. I don't think anybody ever. There was never this like trend of saying "okay, boomer" as a compliment, right? It was always a negative thing. But again, I'm using this example because it's kind of like the rhetoric thing or the feminism thing, where okay, the word's weaponized or the phrase is weaponized, but it's totally far removed from what it means. Like the word boomer is referring to a generation. When you say "okay, boomer" as a criticism, it is an illogical statement that you're making. Like, you just sound stupid, quite frankly. And here's why it's stupid. The word boomer is referring to a specific generation. So you're saying because somebody's from a generation, they can't be wrong? Or they can't be right? Does that make any sense? Does that sound logical? Of course it doesn't. So it's a dumb argument. It's a dumb response. Right? That's like, just like it'd be wrong for a boomer to say, well, you're wrong because you're young. Right? You're wrong just because you wouldn't want somebody to tell that person would want them to tell them that, right? So it's just kind of a ridiculous argument. But these are just like little subtle examples of people just taking words and trying to weaponize them in good or bad ways. I'll give you another example where people try to weaponize things like in a positive way, and they're totally like, you're not really making an argument. You're just kind of weaponizing the word. So another good example of this, because I've kind of used mostly negative examples, so like maybe people trying to fake do it in a positive way, is somebody has an idea and like people are debating the idea, and somebody will say, well, that's the progressive thing to do. So the word progressive means it new and innovating for the better, right? That's what the term means. So when you are in a business context and you're coming up with progressive, innovative ideas, basically they're synonyms, they mean the same thing. It means you have improved on things. But now what people do, because the word progressive is kind of seen as like, we're moving forward into the future. It's usually a word that's associated with something good. But what you'll see people do is just because something's new, they slap the label progressive on it, and you're supposed to just give it a pass. Like, well, after all, it's progressive, it's new. Okay, well, it could be a new bad idea. It could be a new stupid thing. Just because it's new doesn't make it progressive. Again, progressive requires new and innovative in a good way, right? But it could be a new crap idea, right? So you see that too, where people say, well, it's progressive, it's great, right? Or they'll say, well, they're, again, in the negative way, you're just using your rhetoric. And it's like, well, that, again, these words or phrases develop emotional meanings that we attach to them, or street lingo meanings that we attach to them as good or bad. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we're out there throwing them around society without people even knowing where those words even came from, what they actually mean, right? And the danger of that is just that words or language can then get weaponized either way, right? As like a good or a bad way. And like I said, the horse gets out of the barn. I think feminism is a good example of that, right? Where most people, I think if you tell them that word, they're going to think extremist, even though that's not quite what it means, right? So I don't know. Maybe those examples are kind of hard to see the connection, but it's just kind of I'm just trying to show you examples where we take language, we attach emotional meaning, and that meaning shapes how we respond to things, how we think of things, just because of the words involved, I guess would be a way to say it, right? Okay, so language can shape reality a lot of different ways here. By the way, a little last note that I did want to mention about this, about shaping reality. Here's another good example of like using figurative language, or so maybe this is probably an easier way for you to see this, is like how language shapes reality. So when you think of figurative language, those are things like metaphors, similes, things like that. So if I say, Shakespeare said, love is like a rose, right? And ruin that line for men for all time, because now none of us can use it because he used it, right? And so now we're stuck trying to be creative on our own, and I'm not sure if we can do it. Although guys out there, for those of you that are not socially retired like me, right? I don't know how you can't be suave and charming and awesome. You've got an iPhone. Like, you have the entire world right here. And so when you're texting, because you guys are all socializing, through mediated channels, like, how can you not sound cool and charming and suave? I don't get it. Right? You just Google anything while you're chatting her up. So, I mean, you guys have no excuse. Back in my day, we had to walk 10 miles in the snow, uphill both ways. We didn't have the little cheat in our pockets to help us, right? We had to actually talk to people. But, all right, I digress. Sorry. Okay. So here, an example, like you take like figurative language. So Shakespeare said love is like a rose. So what does he mean by that? So when you say, when I'm talking about love, so love is like a rose. So that probably means he's probably talking about things like it's like both sides of the coin, right? So it's beautiful, it blooms, it grows, right? It's pretty, it's all these things, right? But obviously there's bad things about a rose. It eventually dies, it's thorny, right? All this sorts of stuff. And so when he says love is like a rose, that can shape your reality. Like, you can think of all kinds of things. Okay? And if you, instead of saying that, you just said, love is beautiful, love grows. If I just say love grows, all you can think about is that love grows. But if I say love is like a rose, you can think about the fact that it grows, it's beautiful, it blooms, it's all these sorts of things. And also, it can be a cautionary tale that a lot of times it dies. There can be thorns along the way, right? You can gain a lot more from it through the figurative language. So in other words, sometimes when you're not literal, when you're not direct and you use language that way, it can shape a broader creative reality. So the reason why this may resonate a little bit easier with you when I use this example, like figurative language, is just think of like fictional works. Like, why do people get so captivated by Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or any works of fiction, really, or movies and things like that? Like, movies is obviously also incorporating visual elements, but the point is that when you're figurative, it allows you to open up all of these sorts of meanings for people and different realities, because everybody can take things different from them. It's sort of like another good example that would be like poetry or music. Two people can hear a song and take totally different things from it, right? Because the song is speaking to them in different ways because of that figurative language, because it can mean all kinds of things, right? It's sort of like saying, if you want to say you're depressed, and the first person says, I'm depressed, and the second person says, I fell through a trap door of despair, right? When you say you fell through a trap door of despair, you're saying more than you're depressed. It was sudden. I don't know if I can get out, right? Or it felt like, if you said it felt like quicksand, right? I don't know if I can survive this. All this, it was unexpected. So this is another way that you can shape reality in multiple ways. And again, people can, when you use figurative language, again, obviously the most common example of this would be like music or poetry or things like that. And it speaks to people in different ways. That's a good example of how you can shape reality. So language just kind of does a lot of things to our advantage. So I want to talk a little bit about how you could kind of like little kind of subtle tips and tricks to use this to your advantage, right? So let's talk about empowering language. So this basically just deals with perceptions of you. So using empowering language. So empowering language is basically any kind of language that conveys that you're knowledgeable, that you are confident, right, in what you're saying, that you're trustworthy for somebody to listen to, and that sort of stuff, right? Powerless language is more or less its hedges, its hesitations. It can even be politeness in certain contexts where people sort of mistake kindness for weakness, kind of a thing. It's sort of like, again, if we're in the conference room and we're in the meeting and somebody says, what should we do? And Bob says, I think we should do A. It's more customer focused, or we should do A. It's going to increase profits. And Rick says, it's just my opinion, but I think we should do B. I'm not saying Bob's wrong, but I think we should do B. Now, who sounds more confident? First guy does, right? And he's going to sound more empowered, more likely that he knows what he's talking about, and people are more likely to follow him, right? Because he kind of fits our image of somebody who's a leader, right? And so a lot of times it's just about hedges, hesitations, politeness, that sort of stuff. So you want to, whenever you express your opinion, when you're talking or using your language, what I'm basically trying to get at here is you don't want to use these hedges. You don't want to use hesitations. You want to come across confident in what you're saying. So there's a couple of ways to do that. And the first way is just don't hedge or hesitate. If you've taken a writing course yet, or if you've ever taken a writing course, a formal writing class, one of the things they'll talk about is when you have an opinion, you just say your opinion. You don't say, it's my belief that. You just say your opinion. If you don't cite it, people know it's your opinion, right? Because you'll come, it's this more, you don't want to use this passive voice when you're writing. Well, the same thing happens when you're speaking, so don't use these hedges. The second key for people to believe that you're knowledgeable, confident in what you're saying, their perception of you, is that you're detailed. Devil's in the detail. If you are detailed, people give you the benefit of the doubt that you must know what you're talking about. Okay. By the way, speaking of weaponizing language, I just mentioned before, like words with positive, negative emotions, they get weaponized for good or bad based on the emotions associated with them or the feelings of people associated with them. Well, one of the things that we know is that if people are detailed, typically an audience will assume they must be telling the truth or they must know what they're talking about, right? And so this can be used in a way to make you come across powerful and more in the perception of you. But again, sometimes people manipulate that. So going back to where I said language gets used in a negative way. So sometimes what you'll see is somebody is commenting on something or they're arguing about something back and forth, and they don't really have a good response or a good argument. So they do what's called, the actual technical sort of rhetoric term for this is what's called word salad. where essentially I'm just going to use a bunch of big words that are above most of my audience's head, and because I'm talking fancy, they're going to assume that what I'm saying must be true. And unfortunately, sadly, that's true. That works. I see it all the time, right? And you see it all the time when people are commenting on something. So, but if you actually know the topic and you know what they're talking about, you know that what they're saying is all BS, right? But because they're using those words and they're not using the hedges, right? They're being detailed, right? People just give them the benefit of the doubt. Okay. So in terms of language, it's not using the hedges and it's being detailed. So you want to, and obviously we're talking, I've given you a lot of negative examples in this video, but obviously I want you to use these in good ways, in positive, meaning positive ways that are positive for you, the people you care about, and society at large. Certainly don't want you to use these in a negative way. So we're going to talk a little bit about like we're using powerful language. So it's really, in terms of language, it's those two things. It's that you don't use hesitations and that you're detailed. The devil's in the detail. And I'm going to give you some examples of that right here, and like how audiences and just people tend to perceive this in like one-on-one settings, professional settings, interpersonal settings. So, all right, example of disempowering versus empowering. So disempowering, if you just say, again, the hedges, it's just my opinion, but that would be better. Again, it's not being detailed. I'm sorry. Not detailed versus saying, I apologize. What am I apologizing for? And what am I going to do to fix it? That's detailed. We'll have to agree to disagree. Nobody likes that. It basically sounds like you're just taking your ball and going home. Say, I see it differently. Here's how I view it. Right? Just give your opinion. So you'll see here, some of these are just being more detailed. Some are not using the hedges. But when you do studies with people, the most common example that you guys are going to deal with throughout your life is an apology, right? So when you just say, I'm sorry, my bad, most people, like research on apologies, they don't think you're sorry. Because it's pretty easy to just say, I'm sorry, right? But if you say, and this is why, like celebrities, for example, when they have to give the apology speech or something, and their handlers, like the PR firms, right, that help them out, they tell them you got to do the following things. You got to say, I'm sorry, but then you got to say, what are you sorry for? You have to take, because then people feel like you're taking accountability. And then you have to say what you're going to do, right? What you're going to do to fix it. If you do that, audiences are way more likely to believe that apology is sincere, right? And what's the difference? Just being detailed. If you say it's better versus you say, I believe, I have a solution, I have an answer, and you say what the answer is, you're being detailed, right? A more customer-focused solution. You're saying why you think it's better. The customers will like it, right? And people just assume, well, because you're detailed, well, you must know what you're talking about, right? I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, right? Especially if they don't know much about the topic. So you can kind of, you're going to get away with more. Here's an example of this is looking at like job resumes and things like that. So this was a study done with LinkedIn and like some of these job sites like Career Builder, and they were talking to Fortune 500 companies, and they were asking, so languages that applicants use on cover letters, resumes, and in the job interview, what do you think was empowering, made you feel like they were confident and gave you confidence in potentially hiring them versus disempowering? And so what they said was good was things like created, increased, reduced, improved, developed, accomplished. But then they said what was bad was responsible, strategic, creative, effective, expert. Now, if you're anything like me, you're going to look at that list and you're going to go, what the heck's the difference? What the HE double hockey sticks? Right? So for example, they're telling you created is good, but creative is bad. What? Come on. Are we overanalyzing here? So here's the difference. The difference is being detailed. Because think about it. If you say the word created, you have to say what you created. Right? If you use the word improved in a sentence, you have to say what you improved on. In other words, you have to be detailed. Everything on that side of the list, you have to be detailed. People can't just say, tell me a situation at work that you improved on, and you can't just say, well, I improved, and then not say what it is, right? But you can say, I'm creative in a cover letter or in an interview. Yeah, I'm creative. right? I'm responsible, I'm strategic, I'm an expert. You can use all of the words on that side of the list without saying any real detail. So the difference is be detailed. Remember I said that's the second key. Is you got to not use the hedges, and you got to be detailed. If you give a detailed plan, people will give you the benefit of the doubt. And if you're sincere in it, because you should be, I'm saying use this in a good way. You want people to be confident in you because they should be confident in you, right? So I'm not saying don't be sincere with the details, like have a real plan. But I'm saying express that plan. Say what the plan is. Show your work, people, right? By the way, this goes back to if you watch the video on nonverbals, just to like bring this full circle, the third thing about like audience's perception of you empowering, and it deals with nonverbals, so we're not really going to talk about it here. But the third ring of this, so you have don't use the hedges, be detailed, is to be organized, right? Come across as you have your crap together, that you're organized. And that's everything from if it's a presentation to, literally having PowerPoints and things like that, and like delivery and all that kind of stuff, to even just like looking the part, right? And that sort of stuff, looking professional, that sort of stuff. Because just like being detailed, audiences are likely to presume that you know what you're talking about. If you're detailed, another thing that if you're organized, another thing that happens is audiences also give you the benefit of the doubt. So again, I think the example I used in that video is if we put all three of these together, I don't use the hedges, I'm detailed with the plan, I say what I'm going to do, right? And I'm organized about it. Like I can come in the room and talk to you about Papa Smurf and Bigfoot and name a third thing, and you'll be like, sure, absolutely, right? And now some of you right now, you're like, what are you talking about? Bigfoot is real. Maybe Bigfoot is. I don't know. But my point is, like, people just they'll give you a pass. They will generally presume that you know what you're talking about, right? So those are the three. So again, it's not rocket science. You look at that list and it seems like what's the difference? But it's really just about being detailed. That's the difference. And by the way, this also brings up a point that I think I had mentioned before, that this is part of why you have the glass ceiling in the workplace a little bit in terms of like gender inequality. So in a lot of job environments, women are paid less than men for the same job, same experience, same background, same education, you name it, right? Like it's that way in my field. So attorneys, where you could have two people with the same qualifications and credentials, but the male attorney is likely going to make more. And is some of that because of some sort of discrimination? Maybe, right? But one of the things that's going on here is it's not really intentional. It's not that there's some grand conspiracy so much as it's about perception. And one of the things that we know through workplace communication, like, and you could take all classes on organizational communication and company culture, is that women use more hedges and hesitations in the workplace. Women will tend to, when they give their opinion in that meeting, they're more likely to say things like, it's just my opinion, but I'm not saying Eric is wrong, but I think we should do B. And they don't come across as confident and as assertive, right? And so what happens is they are not going to fit your like ideal perception of captain CEO, captain leader, and they tend to not get promoted versus the male who just like tells the opinion. And this kind of deals a little bit with like high-low context thing, cultures issue, because if you consider like gender as culture, one of the things that's going on is that women have a tendency to get socialized to be to communicate in a way that focuses on not offending people, right? Maintaining harmony in the group, and men just aren't socialized that way, the same way to communicate that way. But anyway, so you see this happen, and we actually see this happen in studies that look at like female-run companies where the pay gap is still there, right? So it's like female on female crime. So it's not, again, I think a lot of this is perception. It's not necessarily a purposeful thing. All right. Rogerian arguments. So now we're talking about how to use certain things, to use language to your advantage. Now what we're really talking about here, and what we're getting into with this one, is basically studies on when you come into the room and you're going to tell people that they're doing A and they should do B. They should change course. They should course correct, or you're going to make an argument with them. This is basically kind of studying, does it matter what your tact is? Like if you come in the room and you're basically like, I'm just going to tell it like it is. You need to hear this. You're being stupid. Stop being stupid. Okay? Versus, I'm going to try to massage it. No, I don't want to offend you. So I'm going to say it in a way it's going to be nice and cuddly. Right? So it's basically, you come in the room, you got a pillow here if you need this to sit on because I'm going to tell you some tough stuff. Or you say, if you got an issue, I got a tissue. Tough. Right? It's like, how gruff do you be, basically? So the research is like, does this matter? Right? Like, you're going to try to persuade people. Does it matter if you choose language that's really gruff and it's like really direct and you don't care if people get offended? Or if you use language that's trying to massage things a little bit? Okay. Well, it turns out it's better to be a little nicer. Okay. And one of the problems is that is counter to what we see in popular culture. And what I mean by that is TV, social media, like all of the like supposed like really successful business leaders and like leaders of these different things who are in these positions, when you see them interact with people, it's very gruff and like, I'm going to tell it like it is, right? And I have some examples here. So examples, probably the one you're most familiar with is like Shark Tank, where you have these people with all the money and they're the investors and people come on, they pitch an idea and basically they tell them whether or not, I'll invest in your project, but you got to give me maybe 70% of the profits. And I'm going to front so much up front, but I'm taking everything after that. So they're not making them a deal, right? Making them an offer. And if any of the inventors push back at all, they're like, well, I don't want to give you 7% of the profits. It's my idea, right? You're just the bank. I'm the brains behind it. And they'll scoff at them or they'll make some snarky comment, right? Well, if you didn't need me, why are you here? Kind of stuff, right? Or if you think of Bar Rescue, if you don't know Bar Rescue, it's this show where this guy named John Taffer, he has run a lot of successful bars and restaurants. He comes into a failing bar or restaurant and he gives them advice to how to fix it. And usually he comes in, there's all kinds of problems. A lot of times it's either dirty, it's mismanaged, it's poorly run, all that sorts of stuff, bad customer service. And he gets in their face, right? He's not like soft about it. He doesn't care about hurting their feelings. He's like, you're being an idiot. And he'll tell them you're being an idiot. He'll call them all kinds of names. He'll throw food. He'll tell everybody, he'll close down the bar so he can like fix it up. Or if you guys think of Gordon Ramsay in Hell's Kitchen, right? Like he is just cursing up a storm at these chefs, get their crap together, all this stuff. It's like very gruff, right? That kind of style. And you could think of all kinds of other examples. Well, here's the thing about that. You see this all the time on TV, on all these shows, and in a lot of different situations where people talk a big game this way. But this does not work in any real kind of setting. Doesn't work. And by the way, it doesn't work for them in real settings either. Fun fact. What's the difference? Well, you see this in popular culture in all these settings. Here is the difference. Okay. So the difference is, while these shows are based on, let's start with the TV. Okay. So while these shows are based in reality, they are not realistic situations. There's a difference. So in most realistic situations, the power dynamic is equal. If you come into my office and you're a potential client, and let's say you have a situation where I'd have the most power. So you have a really technical situation where you really need an attorney. It's not the kind of thing you can represent yourself. And maybe you need an attorney who is specialized in something that I know a lot about. So you need me because you need my experience or my knowledge. Okay, so I have some power. But you have power too. What's your power? Your power is your money. Because I need it to keep the lights on. Right? I need it to pay for my sports package so I can watch my baseball team. I need it. A lot of pressure on me. I got to buy cat food. I got a lot going on. Okay? So the power's kind of equal, so I just can't be a total jerk to you. Right? On these shows, the power's not equal. On these shows, the power's like 90% the host, if not 95%, and 5% the contestant. Now, this isn't college knowledge. Like, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You have to go to college to know that when somebody has all the power in a situation, can you be an a-hole? Can you be a jerk? Yeah, you can. And by the way, does being a jerk get good ratings? Yes, it does. So, they have all the power, so they have a chance to take advantage of it. And taking advantage of it is good ratings, so of course the producers are encouraging it, right? And when I say they have all the power, so let's think about it. if Mark Cuban, if says, I will fund your project, give me 80% of the profits. Okay. And let's say, and the person gives pushback and Cuban makes some snarky comments or whatever, but eventually the person agrees to it, right? If every business venture that Mark Cuban or Alex Rodriguez or Mr. Wonderful funds on Shark Tank, if all of them fail, do you think that hurts Mark Cuban? He's got billions of dollars. It means nothing. It does not affect his life if that fails, right? If these bars or restaurants fail on Bar Rescue, and by the way, most of them do. Like at the end of the episode, they usually fade to black. If you've ever watched these, and they say sales increased by 20% the first month, and Karen is hopeful. But but that show was taped months ago, right? If you ever Google the bars, you find out a lot of them still failed because you can't really fix all the problems and all this sorts of stuff in the week they're filming, right? And so they still fail. But think about it: when these bars are fail or the chefs fail or whatever, does that affect Jon Taffer? No, he runs all kinds of other successful businesses. He's got no skin in the game beyond the show doing well, right? So he can be a jerk. He can take all kinds of chances. They can do all this stuff, or Mark Cuban can fund something and be an ass to you while he's funding it, and on the show for good ratings, and it's not going to matter if it fails or not. He has no beyond creating good ratings. He has no skin in the game because the power's way off. Now, so it's not a realistic scenario. They just do it because it makes good ratings. And in real scenarios, if Taffer walks into a bar or a restaurant and he wants to work with them or partner with them on some sort of venture, but the bar or restaurant is independently successful, do you think he can act that way? If Gordon Ramsay walks into another Michelin star restaurant, right, and there's another world-renowned chef there, you think he's going to act that way? Because they're going to yell right back at him. They don't need him, right? Like, the power's equal. And another successful bar or restaurant doesn't need Jon Taffer. And other NBA owners don't need Mark Cuban. They got their own billions, right? So you can't act that way. Because it doesn't get you in those real powerful situations, right? It doesn't get you what you're looking for. And you could think of all kinds of other examples of it. And if you think it got the person what they wanted, I think if you did a little more digging, you could see that behavior in real world did not get them what they wanted. It doesn't work. Because in the real world, the power is kind of even, right? But it's not on these shows. So I think one of the problems is you see in popular culture, this gets pushed as like the way to do things, and it doesn't work with most people. And look, you know this. This is common sense. If somebody comes in the room and they completely offend you and they call you a moron, does that person, when that happens to somebody, do they then go, you're right, I am a moron. Thank you for pointing that out. I'll do better. No, they get defensive, right? They get upset and they storm off. In fact, you see that on these shows. Like on Bar Rescue is a really good example of that. Like the first part of the show, he walks in, he tells them how they're doing everything so stupid, and there's a shouting match, and the owner storms off, and then they come right back, right? After the commercial break. But first they do get defensive and they act that way. Now the reason they come back is again because the power dynamic's all weird. So, by the way, why do a lot of these bars still fail? Or Shark Tank, like why do sometimes these projects still fail and all this sorts of stuff? Hell's Kitchen isn't necessarily a good example because they are trained chefs and all sorts. But like if you take Bar Rescue or sometimes like Shark Tank, because this kind of brings up another important thing that like will get talked about if you take like a business class or an entrepreneurship class or things like that, or leadership management classes and all that sort of stuff, is that to do anything in life, right, to be good at it, you need two things. Anything in life, anything. You need opportunity and you need skill. So you have to have the skill to do it and the opportunity. What a lot of people tell themselves, because it's kind of like it's more convenient because you don't have to do all the work, right? You're trying to lie to yourself that I don't have to do the work, is that if I just had the opportunity, it would work out. So you take Bar Rescue. Okay, sometimes at the beginning of the episodes, they'll say, so why'd you open a bar? And the person's like, well, I like bars. I spent most of my 20s in college in one. And my friends liked hanging out in the bar. And my great aunt Ruthie died. And so I came into some money, right? And so we decided to open a bar. So what happened in this scenario? I'm not saying running a bar is a bad thing, but what happened here? So what happened is that they got opportunity. They had the money to open a bar or restaurant, but they didn't have the skill. They didn't know anything about running a bar, anything about running a restaurant, and that's why they fail. You need both. And what's the lesson to, or like if you take Shark Tank, sometimes the person has the idea, which is if it's a good enough idea, then you could argue they got half the opportunity, but they need the other half, which is the money part of the opportunity, right? But they don't have the skill yet. They don't also learn about running a business and how to market and all that sort of stuff, right? And so the point about this, where I said like sometimes people use this as an excuse to not do the work, or they just don't think about it. They try to simplify what it takes to do things in life. Is that you can't just sit around like saying, well, if I just had the opportunity, everything would work out. It doesn't work that way. You need the skill too. So what's the lesson from that? Well, on one hand, it means obviously you try to do things to get the opportunity, put yourself in a position to have the opportunity. But what it also means is while you're waiting for the opportunity, get the skill. Get the skill, right? Like later we have a video on relationships, and I talk about how, when people are single, one of the things that you get told is, well, this is a chance to work on you, right? And nobody likes to hear that, right? Find out what you want, what would make you happy, right? Nobody likes to hear that when they're, especially if they've just broken up or something like that, right? But anyway, there's some truth in that, because think about it. If your dream person walks in the door and says, I want to date you, you now have opportunity, okay? But guess what? If you don't have the skill, meaning if while you were alone, if you didn't work on yourself to be able to have the skill to have a successful, healthy relationship, like all the things that broke up your prior relationships, if you haven't fixed those problems, they're going to reoccur in the new opportunity, right? And you're going to screw it up. So just because you have the opportunity does not mean you're going to be successful at something. You need both. You need skill and opportunity. So my point is, if you're waiting on one, work on the other. Or if you're waiting on both, make sure you're working on both, right? Because you see that in a lot of these situations where people fail, and it's one or the other that they just sort of like took for granted. They assume, they're like, I'll deal with that later. You got to deal with them both, right? So you need both. So, all right. So again, this is just a really bad tactic to sort of take in the real world, even though you see people act this way, right? They act this way, but they usually do not get what they want, and in real settings, right? And the only time they kind of get what they want by acting this way is either it's not realistic because it's like a TV world where they're doing this for ratings, or something's wrong with the power dynamic. So the power dynamic is like 95-5 or something like that. But and again, you have to ask yourself, am I going to be in a 95-5 situation power-wise? Probably not, right? So don't rules for thee, but not for you, right? Don't follow these kind of tactics. All right, so what does rhetorical argument say? It basically just says what you should do is acknowledge any common ground and the merits of the other side first. So instead of walking the room and saying, you idiot, right? You basically start out by saying, all right, you were doing A. I could see why you were doing A. This establishes some credibility if you acknowledge the other side, right? It also allows you to identify issues that can be resolved kind of quickly. And like, so look, we already agree on things 1, 2, and 3. We just got to ham out the other two. And then you discuss ways that your goal, whatever it is you're trying to convince them to do, they're doing A, you want them to do B, how that can also satisfy those exact same interests that they had. So where they were coming from. So again, in that workplace scenario, like going back to bar rescue, one of the common problems is you'll have somebody who's running the bar and they've just hired a bunch of their friends. And then when their friends are screwing up or taking advantage of them, it's kind of hard to fire your friends or even criticize your friends, right? And so an example would be is if on one hand, if you came in the room and just said, you're an idiot, stop hiring your friends, right? That's probably not going to go over well. If you used a Rogerian argument, what you would do is you would come in the room and you'd say, okay, look, I get why you hired your friends. You like your friends for a reason. They're your, you like them. They're your friends for a reason. You're helping them out by giving a job. That makes sense versus just working with random strangers. I mean, you might be able to trust them more, right? So I get it. But obviously, this creates a conflict when things are going poorly, or if you have to downsize, or you name it. You got to criticize them. That's awkward, right? So I see where you're coming from, but clearly that just creates a conflict that's not going to work, right? Because ultimately, you got to make this business successful for you and your family and the people you care about. So what can we do here? Now, on one hand, you could just you don't work with your friends anymore. And we could just go clean. Could just totally like move on without doing that. But a way to like do the Rogerian argument where it's like a win, still doing the kind of like satisfy some of those interests, would be to say, all right, so I see where you were coming from. I get it. So how about this? You continue to have your friends work here, but let's hire a middle manager. So like you're the owner, your friends are working here, but you hire somebody else who's like the daily manager and have them kind of handle the hirings and the firings moving forward and the criticism and critiquing of current employees. That's way your hands are off of it. Well, we talk to your friends. They understand that too. That way you still get to work with your friends, but we've removed the conflict of interest. So you're doing A, now you're doing B. And so if you approach it that way, I've told you let's do something different, but I didn't call you an idiot, right, to get you to do something different. So that's just likely to be way more effective. And so I guess my point is you want to do this in most situations, because in most situations, the power's kind of even and people are not going to put up with it if you just come in the room and completely criticize them, or they're just going to get defensive when you do that. So in the second part of this video, we are going to start to talk about verbal adjustments. We'll talk about 3 purposes of rhetoric as well, and self-disclosure. So I will see you in that video.